COVID-19 pandemic, the worst global event. COVID-19, also known as coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2, is a respiratory disease that quickly spread around the world, being declared a pandemic on March 11, 2020. During the course of the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus would go on, infecting over 750 million people and killing 6 million of those, according to the WHO. Beyond the many deaths and infections, the pandemic harmed many core aspects of society. What pillars of society the COVID-19 pandemic affected, and how it did so, will be discussed in the following presentation, where I argue that COVID-19 was the worst global event. To start, COVID-19 damaged the economy in a few ways. First, COVID-19 hit the manufacturing and worldwide shipping markets hard. Because a quarantine was imposed in many countries, traditional manufacturing processes were severely hindered or made impossible because workers could not be in the factory or even close to one. Additionally, because COVID hit the entire world, and to the extent the economy is interconnected, supply chains were doomed to fail. These effects hit companies hard, as reported by Sharon Harapka, with a bachelor's degree in business logistics and international business from Penn State University, who found that 57% of companies talked to in a survey reported serious disruptions caused by supply chain issues, and 71% of those companies reported negative impacts. Because of disruptions and loss of revenue, many companies were forced to lay off workers, according to finance professor Sabrina Barua. These layoffs, however, created a self-perpetuating cycle in which consumers were buying less because a large portion of them had been laid off, which reduced company profits, beginning the cycle again. Compounding with this, consumer mentality plays a large role in the health of the economy. And according to Barua, as people become aware of their health and lives, save money avoiding unnecessary purchases, and hoard essential commodities during the lockdown, demand for essential goods is increasing. In contrast, demand for luxury goods is decreasing. When people don't spend money, inflation rises, which is exactly what is reported by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics graph behind me. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic polarized the public. First off, COVID-19 took place during an election year, and thus it was doomed to be politicized in an attempt by politicians to sway voters in their favor. An example of this includes wearing masks, which quickly became politicized. Supporting this writes Austin Hegler, a graduate student with a bachelor's in communication studies and political science, and others, who state, wearing masks in public quickly became a partisan symbol, as Democratic elites promoted mask wearing, whereas Republican elites, most notably former President Trump, dismissed it. Additionally, according to Sol Hart, professor in communication, news stations perpetuated this information because many of them are supported by members of specific political parties, thus inclining them to share disinformation to get more viewership and profit. Constituents shared this misinformation seen in the media, and by doing so, polarized themselves within groups with certain beliefs. Even after the brunt of the pandemic, the after effects of the polarization are still being felt. For example, researcher Sebastian Junkers found that political parties disagree more after the pandemic. Also, the United Nations stated in a report that terrorist groups are now using pandemic-related socioeconomic grievances and political tensions to recruit members. The final aspect of society which COVID-19 severely affected is mental health. Interestingly, COVID-19 touched on all points of the trifecta of damaging mental health. First, COVID-19 caused isolation. A study by Gainson, who attained a bachelor's in occupational therapy, and others found that social isolation due to prolonged lockdown correlated to suicidal thoughts and actions in extreme cases and depressive thoughts in less extreme cases. Additionally, isolation can lead to routine, which may also have negative mental health effects. Nelson Mandela, former South African president and anti-apartheid activist, who was jailed for 27 years, stated in his book, A Long Walk from Freedom, which was also included with Stimulus, that people can fall into a routine because it can make time go faster, that it's easy to lose one's mind in a routine. Fear was the second aspect of the pandemic that was detrimental to mental health. Many people were scared of what was to come in the pandemic and worried for their relatives and friends. No doubt, a stressful environment which has a capacity to weaken mental health. Thirdly, the incapacity and powerlessness felt by those who experienced the pandemic weakened their mental health. Supporting this is Gregory Sala, with a master's in counseling and psychotherapy who writes that powerlessness may be described as an overwhelming feeling of helplessness or inadequacy in stressful situations, making us more susceptible to anxiety, stress, and depression. COVID-19 also worsened existing mental health conditions. For example, in an interview with NPR, an 18-year-old girl named Teja discusses how she relapsed into anorexia because she couldn't go to school due to the pandemic. School was an incentive that encouraged her to eat, and when it was canceled due to the quarantine, she stopped eating. COVID-19 also prevented many resiliency, common coping mechanisms that people use. And a study found in the stimulus package researching resiliency of patients after the 2012 earthquake. Researchers found that cultural factors such as the family, traditional food, and spiritual factors such as going to church helped Haitians to cope with traumatic events, including disasters. Because of the fact that people had to quarantine during the pandemic, they could not use spiritual factors such as going to religious services to cope with the negative effects of the pandemic. To summarize, COVID-19 damaged three core pillars of society: the economy, politics, and mental health. The pandemic had special attributes which allowed it to do this. COVID-19 was globally economically disruptive and was able to change consumer behavior, which contributed to harming the economy when people stopped spending and inflation rose. The pandemic also took place during an election year, which allowed it to be weaponized by politicians and exploited by the media. Finally, COVID-19 damaged mental health and prevented commonly used coping mechanisms. While there have been many disruptive events in the past, the fact that COVID-19 hit on all three aspects of society makes the COVID-19 pandemic the worst war.
Thank you. Gabe, what evidence did you gather that you didn't include?
So and
why did you choose not to include it?
In my second point, which was about the political polarization, in my third point about the mental health, I found a lot of information that was very similar to other information I had, and so I decided not to include it because it was just saying the same thing, very similar aspects. But I was able to use it to vet my sources in that section and determine if they were credible or not. And additionally, in my second point about the political polarization, I decided not to use some sources that were very obviously biased. I found that they were mostly partisan publications, and so I decided to disinclude publications sources.
So what are your implications of what you found out for the community at large?
So some implications that from my conclusions are that COVID-19 was a really bad event, and it's important to know that because when we know that, we can look at what COVID-19 did to the economy, to mental health, to politics. We can say, how can we better prepare for an event